Political Capital is brought to you by Uber Canada. Learn more at uber.com/flexibilityworks.
CHEK Podcasts.
Hey everyone, and welcome to Political Capital, your source for all the latest in BC politics. I'm your host, Rob Shaw, coming to you from the CHEK News World Headquarters in Victoria. The Premier flip-flops on the carbon tax, American-style culture wars on reproductive rights, and a whole bunch of other topics on the show today. If you are watching on CHEK TV or YouTube, make sure you subscribe to the audio podcast for what I assume will be quite a bit of extras. And thanks to our friends at the BC Tech Association who invited our panel to do a special live edition of the show to their audience this week. That was a lot of fun to do. Okay, let's bring in the pod squad. We got tons to talk about this week. Jeff Ferrier, Allie Blades, Jillian Oliver, thank you for being here. Let us begin with the topic of the week. Out of nowhere, Premier David Eby announcing he would eliminate BC's carbon tax if Ottawa were to change the federal rules, allowing him to do so. A policy change that appears to be a bit of a reversal from more than 2 years of Eby saying the carbon tax was a cornerstone of BC's climate plan, and anyone who wanted to stall it or remove it, like Conservative leader John Rustad or Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre, were living in a baloney factory. Well, welcome everyone to the baloney factory that we all live in now, because here we are discussing this issue. Jillian, let's begin with you. What did you make of this?
Well, I think the thing that struck me the most was just how out of nowhere it seemed. I think the NDP could have rolled out adjustments to the carbon tax as part of a broader climate policy and sort of saved them a lot of the criticism that they're getting from all directions right now. You know, right-wing folks are calling them flip-floppers. Greens are saying they're abandoning, their any kind of moral high ground they have on the climate issue. So I think that shows that they are scrambling a little bit, and that the calculations that Eby had made when he was making those comments were made in the context of BC United still being in the running, and that changing the dynamics in a couple of ways. One, that the vote is split on the right, but also because it was the BC Liberals, now BC United, or then BC United, that actually brought in the carbon tax to begin with. I think that it also shows that cost of living and affordability are the number one issue in the province. But I don't really understand how this reconciles the issue, because this was set up as an affordability measure. A lot of people were getting checks back, including the lowest income people struggling the most with affordability. I'm assuming that's going to be gone now if we're removing the consumer aspect of the carbon tax. So, I mean, I think the messiness of this leaves a lot of questions, but it's troubling, especially when, we also saw on Monday, historic deficit. Carbon tax brings in $2.6 billion, and our budget is struggling because of the cost of climate change and wildfires. Not to mention, other industries like the agricultural sector struggling and needing government support because of climate change. So a lot of questions, and I think this is going to really elevate this as an issue going into the campaign.
The affordability question, it's not as if almost every single opposition MLA in the legislature was not asking that very question when gas prices peaked this spring. Would it be affordable? Is there not an affordability concern on the carbon tax? And the answer from the government, as you pointed out, Jillian, was people get more money back in this rebate program than they spend in the carbon tax. And today, or on Thursday, to have it now be called unaffordable is a bit of a message change. Jeff, let's bring you in. What do you think?
I think it was a remarkable a day in BC politics for a whole bunch of reasons. The first thing I want to do is clarify that he hasn't promised to cancel or the tax. He said he will respect the will of voters in the federal election, who will make a decision on what happens with the federal carbon tax. You see campaigners in this campaign, John Rustad specifically, saying, "I will cancel the BC carbon tax," which he can't actually do. If you get rid of the BC carbon tax, the federal carbon tax takes effect in British Columbia, and then nothing changes for consumers, and then all you end up with is a loss of control over tax and environmental policy in BC, which no one wants. I think the calculation here was from the government side that affordability is too pressing and big an issue to ignore in this campaign, that taking this step in response to where BC voters are at, some call it flip-flopping, some call it listening to people, and we can talk more about that, demonstrates to folks here in British Columbia who think that, we trust David Eby on the issue, but we think we're going on the wrong track. That's a really dangerous place for government. This is a demonstration by government that you're right to trust us on the issues because we'll listen to you when you're telling us that you support climate action. But right now, you and your family and your friends and neighbors can't afford it right now. And so I think you'll see that the government tried to pivot from this to a broader discussion of, okay, now that that's gone, what are the things that we do to address climate action? And the argument they'll make is that the Conservatives, their chief opponents, will do nothing to try and reduce emissions. And then the debate will be better for them. Anyways, there's lots to unpack. And
let's bring in Allie. Allie, what do you think of that? We have a very powerful message that appears to be powerful from the Conservative side, axe the tax, colliding with the affordability issue on the NDP and resulting in this announcement.
Well, I have a Conservative axe the tax sign if David Eby wants to borrow it for his campaign. I mean,
there are some NDP ones from 2009. The NDP
not getting rid of all the tax, just on consumers. It stays on the big polluters, the industries. But point taken.
That doesn't fit on a sign, Jeff. That's too long.
It's not marketable.
Relief for people. Tax the big polluters. That can almost fit on a very big button.
Try putting that on a sash. It's not going to fit.
Don't tempt me.
Yeah, go ahead, Allie.
This is a premier who, for the longest time, said, over my dead body, God forbid, I'm going to stand firm on this issue. And now here we are, where he has famously flip-flopped on the topic. And let's talk about the political strategy here, because that's really all that it is. Let's not get confused that that the NDP did this for any other reason. That the election is going to officially start in a matter, I think it's next week, and that voters are paying attention and all of those election reasons. But when we were having these conversations about standing firm on the carbon tax, this was when he was way ahead in the polls, and now he's neck and neck with John Rustad, and so he needed to do something in a big shift and a big announcement. And I mean, I'm still in shock. I still feel like I'm going to wake up from this and this never happened, because it was just so stunning of an announcement. And that's all it is. But then the other criticism on this topic is, well, is it just a pre-election announcement? Will it actually happen if they were elected to government again? It's based on all of these contingencies, right? It's a contingent on the federal government. And so if it doesn't happen a year from now, well, it wasn't my fault. It's the federal fault, the Fed and Ottawa's fault, which seems to be a line from David Eby that he likes to use every once in a while. It's not my fault. I didn't get enough money from Ottawa, or we didn't get the approval from X. And so I just don't believe him, to be honest.
Mm-hmm. What is the risk, Allie? I want to stay with you on this one. What is the risk that this becomes less of a policy discussion for Eby and more of a character discussion? And that when you have a long tail of 2 years of defending this tax in the legislature, in the public, in the media, saying that it's a cornerstone of your platform, calling other people weak leaders who lack courage for standing up for children's future when they want to not even to scrap the tax, in some cases just freeze the rate, and others. What is the risk that it then becomes a sniff test, kind of Kinder Morgan 2013 NDP pipeline reversal, or Gordon Campbell 2009 HST, where you say one thing and then the policy is a different thing, and then people just go, I'm not sure what kind of leader you are. What is the risk in that, do you think?
Well, that's the political strategist calculation in all of this, because the brand of the party and the brand of the leader matter a lot, and that's really why people go out to vote, is for the leader and the party. Now, I think this is an opportunity for any opposing party to really label David Eby as this flip-flopper. You cannot be trusted. He's going to say whatever it takes to keep power, and climate be darned. And so I think this is a pivotal moment for David Eby specifically, because he, on this untrustworthy brand, could really take down the NDP.
Jeff, I don't want to give you post-traumatic stress syndrome from the 2013 Kinder Morgan mention. I know you were on that campaign, but do you see any similarities at all where an issue that is a policy issue becomes a character issue due to the kind of position change that voters don't understand?
I think David Eby will run a one-on-one campaign against John Rustad on the issue of character every election that you'll see. I think it takes a strength of character to listen to voters when they are telling you, in the face of what you've been saying for years, we believe in climate change. We want to see action, but we're broke and we can't do this ourselves. And he's got studies from science saying that it's the industrial side of the equation that delivers the biggest results on carbon pricing, and then the transportation and building sector, where people pay, it's not nearly as effective. I think it takes a strength of character to say, I hear you, and we're going to make a change. And if he didn't do that, then what you'd be hearing from the opposition parties was, what kind of weak leader doesn't listen to people who are telling him that there's no sense in taxing people into poverty to try and change the weather, right? And so it's all political from the opposition side. I'd like to understand where John Rustad. I like to see John Rustad flip flop on some issues. I like to see him, and we'll talk about some of those issues later in the show. I'd like to see him flip flop on vaccines making you into magnets. So I'd like to see him flip-flop on 5G being an agent of genocide.
I mean, reverse the magnetic pull?
I'd like to see him actually call out his candidates and say that they did things wrong when they say that LGBTQ folks are groomers. It takes, I'd like to see him pivot and change on those issues. And I don't think it's an inherent weakness for someone to change tack, because voters are telling them, the government, that they want to change tack.
Yeah, no, we've talked on the show a bit about the art of the pivot and the John Horgan way of doing it, and the kind of taking it on yourself and recognizing that maybe you were on the wrong track and apologizing and shifting into a different track. I don't think I saw that from David Eby 20 minutes into a press conference that was called to say voters can't trust John Rustad on some issues that we'll talk about later. I'm not sure he executed that pivot. And by I'm not sure, I mean, I don't think he did at all. Jillian, do you think he landed the art of the pivot that we talk about?
Moderation.
Cut Jeff's feed.
Fair.
Do we think he landed the pivot the way we've talked about in the past, that sort of allows a leader to get around an issue and change and voters to go, okay, we feel like we were listened to?
Not really. Like I said, I think this would have been a lot stronger rolled out as part of like a broader kind of reframing of their approach to climate policy. I think, one thing that's important to remember here, though, is that voters aren't a monolith. I think that there are people, like Jeff says, that are going to say, I think that I've been struggling with the carbon tax. Things are too tight. I don't think I can afford it anymore. And this is going to appeal to them. They're going to feel like the NDP is listening. But I also think that there's other, voters that care more about the environment, that think about these issues a little bit more, that are going to feel betrayed and feel like this is a knock against their ability to trust the government on this issue. So I think, from that perspective, I think this gives the NDP candidates at the door that are door knocking every day the ability to sort of tell people that they're coming face to face with that, they support some relief if things go that way federally. So, I think we'll have to see how it plays out. I think perhaps the calculation is that the NDP is happy to sort of sacrifice some of the more green leading voters if that means they can can stave off conservative voters or voters switching to the Conservatives in some of those closer races in the Lower Mainland compared to places like Vancouver Island, where they might, risk losing a little bit of support to the Greens.
Can I just jump in and say real quick? I think there's an assumption that Green voters are monolithically supportive of the consumer carbon tax. And I think that there's a big percentage of Green voters who are feeling the affordability issues and want to see climate action, who are going to support this. And that it's dangerous, I would say, for Greens, except in some select ridings, to come out really hard on this, because there's going to be Green voters who are saying it should absolutely be oil and gas and the big polluters who pay, and it shouldn't be me, and that's not fair.
But except they're already giving huge tax breaks to the LNG industry, right? So it's sort of like that's what I'm saying about without this coming in the context of a larger plan, it becomes an issue of trust on this issue overall.
Yeah, but that's an issue like that. I think it's a very fair point, and it's an issue that we will discuss. But I think that for a lot of voters who aren't as tuned in as us, that there is an appeal to this, that maybe folks who are that we should consider.
Yeah, Jillian, just before we go to Allie, what do you think the Greens have to do to capitalize on this? What position does it put them in to message this, or to take it to and use it to their advantage, or to try to parlay it into that position we keep talking about with the Greens as maybe the alternative to two parties that are, I guess now on this issue, saying almost the same thing?
Yeah, I think it is to sort of pick at that broader issue of trust, going back to that LNG promise that, kind of was broken. The NDP has a track record of sort of making these kind of vague promises that they're going to deliver on the environment and then not. Same with old growth logging. So there's multiple instances where voters who care about these issues have been let down by the NDP. And I think the Greens can sort of say, look, we also support reframing climate as an affordability issue, but this just shows that the NDP is making up these things on the fly, and at the end of the day, it's not going to be their priority. They're just going to kind of bend towards the right, towards the Conservatives when they're faced with criticism, and you need us in there as that voice of conscience if you want this issue to still be a priority.
Allie, the competing messages that we're going to see here, or voters that are going to face, is, from the NDP, that we listened and we're changing on the carbon tax, and then the Conservatives undoubtedly are going to say, and they're already saying, you're just copying us. You're just doing what we said you should have done a long time ago. How does that play out, do you think? And are we going to keep seeing that, or will those messages change as we kind of get the public reaction to this?
Well, when we talk about the NDP listening to the voter, I don't think that in this particular case that it was so much as listening to the voter and more realizing that something's got to give because we're neck and neck in the polls. So I think this was more of a polling decision, an election strategy, not what they're hearing at the door. At the door, obviously, people are talking about affordability. It's going to be one of our top issues in the election, and therefore we want to see some policy to get us into a better place. Now, I like to observe how candidates release and launch information, and do they develop a comprehensive campaign behind it? To Jillian's point, I just don't think that this was a well thought out thing, in that this was a decision made based on the fact that the election's right around the corner. If it was, if it was a strategic initiative that they really believe in, then what we would have saw was a David Eby who typically presents at a podium very confidently, but what I heard in his voice was kind of like this embarrassing tone, that he was embarrassed because that the affordability or the deficit, the billions of dollars in deficit earlier in the week, now, oh gosh, I have to pivot into something that is going to save some people some money because of this announcement earlier in the week that doesn't make the NDP look like solid fiscal managers of our provincial budget. And so I just don't see David Eby being very confident in this decision. Therefore, to my earlier point, we could see him revert back to we're not going to do anything about this a year from now.
Yeah, I heard the press conference too, and what I heard was campaign David Eby. I didn't hear kind of cautious David Eby, who's been, if we're being honest, too timid in the lead up to the election. He was strong and resolute, and he was clear on how he was contrasting with the Conservatives, taking his shots at his Conservatives unapologetically. The gloves were off. This is a guy who was found the lane he wants to be in and has decided to drive in it. Speaking of, but if you want to talk about people who are changing lanes, let's talk about Andrew Weaver. Andrew Weaver, who's a former leader of a party, and now he is so dismayed that David Eby is abandoning this carbon tax that he's made the completely logical decision to endorse and support John Rustad and the BC Conservatives, who don't think that climate change is a threat or an existential threat or a priority, which I think makes clear to everyone watching BC politics, because he was a leader of a Green, he supported Horgan, now he's with the Conservatives, that Andrew Weaver's political positions and endorsements are based on who's willing to take Andrew Weaver's phone calls and who's most willing to make him feel like he's important. And so that's our Andrew Weaver. Someone just give that guy a hug. He's so insecure. He's just, didn't his parents love him when he was a kid?
Okay, just to jump in for a second there, Allie, I want to give you one last chance before we run out of time here. Andrew Weaver and the confusion over that.
It's still a strong endorsement. Andrew Weaver, despite perhaps our personal opinions about him, he still has a strong following. Look, we're talking about him, so it's working. And so I think that it actually is going to work in the Conservatives' favor to have an endorsement like this.
You know what? He must have someone in his ear, Andrew Weaver. He must have his.
Yardy the parrot.
No one can resist him.
Rustad's parrot. There he is. There he is it's an African gray parrot. That one's red, but it's good.
That's a macaw, but they're still parrots.
It is close enough. If you're listening on the podcast, Jeff just held up a stuffed parrot. So check that out on YouTube. Check out the rest of the show as well. Also, make sure you subscribe, and we'll be back next week with all the latest in BC politics here on Political Capital. Political Capital is brought to you by Uber Canada. Learn more at uber.com/flexibilityworks.